When it comes to forest spirits, sometimes less is more. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. If you're a fan of the Witcher TV series or the books, you're probably familiar with the Leshy, a forest spirit that can take multiple forms, and in the TV series, the books, and the video games, is an enemy, a combatant, somebody that you gotta worry about a little. There also seem to be more than one of them, and we'll get into that. I don't totally understand them all that well in terms of the video game and pop culture aspect, because what I did was go and look into the folklore behind the Slavic mythology of it, rather than the later stuff. But I do very much enjoy when people take folklore and work it into pop culture. It's one of my favorite things, like getting these ancient stories and just distilling them into something for a modern audience that most people would probably never ever see, because let's be realistic, how many of us sit around thinking about what lurks in Baltic forests on a Sunday afternoon? Me, that's who does that. But to get into exactly what we're dealing with right now, it's probably important that I explain what the Slavs are, because while a lot of people are aware that Russians and Poles and Serbians are Slavic, they might not be sure what that means. And that's fair, because to be perfectly honest, I'm a historian, like that's my training, and we don't really even totally understand where the Slavs came from or what they were. We know that they are Europeans. They seem to be from the Indo-European language group, and they have pantheons that resemble the other European early pre-Christian, pre-Roman pantheons, but don't necessarily mix with them. Much like the Roman pantheon was a version of the Greek, the Roman gods with their own more warlike attitude kind of transposed onto it. Of course, there is so much more to it than that, but that's how most people recognize it, is the Roman gods are kind of more warlike and aggressive versions of the Greek gods. And then, of course, the Celtic gods, which are generally associated with specific elements of nature, and the Norse gods, who we have the Aesir and the Vanir. And the way that we think that developed is that the Indo-European people who lived in the Nordic areas, the pre-Germanic and pre-Norse peoples, probably had a more fertility and agriculture and nature-based pantheon of gods and goddesses. And then when the Indo-Europeans came in, they brought with them more warlike gods and goddesses who supplanted the ones that were already there. And by supplanted, I more mean intermingled with. It seems like the Aesir, Thor, Odin, those guys may have been later additions to the pantheon, and that they would have not necessarily subjugated, but placed themselves in a higher position because they came in and didn't want to completely get rid of the culture that was already there, because that's really hard to do as a conqueror, and it's something that made the Romans so effective, was they would come in and they would say, your gods are valid, but so are ours. Continue to worship yours, but make sure you also sacrifice to ours. And it kind of worked for a while. That's a lot of why Christianity didn't work very well. If you look at Rome, there's an early period where the Jews would not sacrifice to the emperor as a god. They would sacrifice to the Jewish god on behalf of the Roman emperor. That's how they worked it out. And then when Christians came onto the scene, they didn't sacrifice at all, so they refused to sacrifice. They would pray for the Roman emperor, but they wouldn't sacrifice for him because it just wasn't something they did. And it's actually why Christianity wasn't even acknowledged as a religion by the Romans at first, because it was just so odd that you wouldn't be sacrificing. But anyway, we're off topic. Back to Slavs. The Slavs have a much more dualist polytheism than a lot of the other European groups. So in their version of things, they have gods that are good and gods that are evil. They have gods of light and order and gods of darkness and chaos. And there are two main gods, and then they have their own groups below them. It's very similar in that respect to Zoroastrianism, as well as Tolkien's Silmarillion creation story of Eru Ilúvatar and Morgoth, and how Eru creates everything and Morgoth warps it. It's very much the same idea, if not exactly the same series of processes. But within the Slavic pantheon of these good and evil deities, there's also gray areas, and there are lesser deities and spirits who have specific responsibilities within the natural world. And one of those is the Leshy. And of course, that could be the Leshys. There is a Slavic god named Sviatibor, who is also identical to the god of lightning in Slavic mythology, But he is referred to in some cases as Lord of the Leshies, which would imply that there's multiple Leshies. But then again, a lot of other sources refer to the Leshy as a specific being. It could also be that each forest has its own Leshy. Now, it could be that the reason we have all these different stories here is that the Slavs weren't actually the people recording their mythology and writing it down and exporting it. That was done primarily by Christians and even pre-Christians, but usually Greeks, Romans, other literate groups that were encountering the Slavs would write down what they believed. One of these was Procopius, for example, who accompanied Belisarius on his campaigns in Africa and Italy and wrote the story of Justinian, and probably my favorite chapter title of any historical work ever, How Justinian Killed a Trillion People. Procopius, just wonderful read. A little dry, but as far as history goes, very, very spicy. But anyway, you're probably wondering, Aiden, how do you keep getting sidetracked with all of these different cultures within your Slavic mythology video? The reason is most of the stuff we have about Slavs comes from other cultures, and I kind of got to talk about it through those lenses, you know? It's also important to mention where the Slavs come from. We believe they originated from somewhere either in the Baltics or Scandinavia, possibly the same place as the Goths. Of course, the term Slav, as you can imagine, is in origin Proto-Germanic. It means the same thing as the English word slave. The English word slave comes from the Nordic languages. And while there's also other terms like thrall that come from Nordic languages, Slav we're pretty firmly of the belief that it was a secondary citizen class or a servant class or even an entire enslaved ethnic group. Regardless, they left Scandinavia sometime after 300 AD, we believe, but before the Vikings started making their way into what is now Russia along the Volga River and the Dnieper. So the Slavs, when they left the far north, formed into three different groups who are affectionately known as the Western Slavs, Eastern Slavs, and Southern Slavs. The Western Slavs are people like the Czechs, the Slovaks, and the Poles. The Eastern Slavs would be the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Moravians, and the Southern Slavs would be groups like the Serbs and the Albanians. So and again, there's a lot more countries and ethnicities that are Slavic that fit into these different groups, but at its core, these are the three main groups of Slavs. They all come from northeastern Europe, and they settled everything that was not already settled by Germans or Greeks. And as they spread throughout the dark and mysterious, misty forests of Eastern Europe, they brought with them their Leshies, which are described as masculine humanoids that are able to take on any likeness. So in their normal form, they appear much the same as you or I, but what does likeness mean? Well, there's a little bit of uncertainty on it. Some of it implies that they could shift into any human appearance, have any nose shape, eye color, hair length, all of that, and then in some cases it suggests that they can shapeshift into animals, but the former seems like the one that's more likely here, because that's the one that kind of gets discussed, whereas them turning into animals, not really referenced. You may be thinking here, oh, is Mother from The Ritual on Netflix a Leshy? No, he's not. It's the bastard child of Loki, and one that they came up with for that movie. It's not actually in Norse mythology. But as far as creating a Norse deity goes, I think they did a bang-up job. Leshy, while they are able to change likeness, can also change their height, and in some traditions this is a voluntary thing. They can be as tall or as short as they wish. In some traditions it is that they match the height of the average tree in their forest, and in others it's that they are as tall as the trees in their forest, and then they can shift down. So basically a Leshy could be able to shift at will, it could be based upon the height of the trees around it, or it could be based upon its own forest, and in its own forest, it's the height of the trees, and outside of its forest, it shrinks to the size of a blade of grass. And then there are some traditions where we're talking about a very, very specific being, perhaps a deity, who is missing his eyebrows, eyelashes, and his right ear. And in what seems to be some sort of thing that Europeans just do, he is sometimes depicted with antlers, which could lead to some of the confusion between the Wendigo and other creatures, because in a lot of ways, it does sort of match the Leshy, and the antlers could have come from that, but we're also not really positive on that either, because the Leshy doesn't always have antlers. Sometimes he's a charming young chap wearing normal clothes and a hat and, hanging out. However, his purpose is much more akin to that of Sasquatch in Native American lore. He is a protector of the forest. He is a being that is neither completely corporeal nor completely ephemeral, and he has a neutral disposition towards human beings. Now, I don't mean that to say that he is always going to be meh towards you. I mean that to say that when it comes to humans, he's neither actively hostile or actively friendly. His disposition is going to be based on how you behave towards the forest. If you come in to, hunt a single deer or maybe chop down a tree for firewood, he's not going to cause a scene. He's going to let you go, let you do it, because you're only taking what's needed. But if you were to come into his woods and chop down an entire swath of trees to create industrialism, the Leshy would probably not be happy with you. In this sense, he's much like the Ents from Lord of the Rings, who are shepherds of the forest, shepherds of the trees. It's kind of the same idea here. So long as you're just passing through or you're only taking what you need, the Leshy will not harm you, might play some tricks on you, have a little bit of fun, or he may even choose to help you, but you should be okay. They're naturally mischievous, but not violent necessarily. Should you do bad things, like start a forest fire, it will probably attack you. But you probably won't see it coming, because in most cases, the Leshy is not seen. Should you encounter the Leshy, you're more likely to hear it singing, laughing, or, of course, whistling, which is just another reason not to follow whistling that you hear in the woods. It could be a friend, it could be a serial killer, it could be a skinwalker, it could be the Leshy. Maybe just don't follow whistling out in the woods. Ever. However, I will say there are some cases where the Leshy is reported to lead travelers astray, often to their deaths in the wilderness, or to abduct children. Now, I've never heard or found what it does after abducting the children, but that could also just be a warning, a cautionary tale to Slavic children not to go running into the forest, much the same way that the Cherokee have, the Cherokee or the Choctaw? I think it's the Choctaw, have Naluza and the Algonquin peoples have the Wendigo, so on and so forth. The Tlingit have the Kushtaka. Just general warnings not to go in the woods, whether it's a real thing they believe in or just a wives' tale to tell kids to scare them. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Kids probably shouldn't run off into the woods on their own. And of course, that does bring us to the end of this video, because honestly, unless I learn Russian, I'm probably not going to be able to learn anything else about Leshy without going to a library. So, I'm Aiden Mattis, and if you like what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can check us out on Patreon to support us for just $1 a month, although of course we have higher tiers if you are feeling generous. We also just launched our coffee, which is Mount Pocono Perk from Tableau Roasting Company. The link to that is in the description as well, as are our links for Target and Gaia Industries. Gaia Industries is a biodegradable products company. They use bamboo to make things like toothbrushes, hairbrushes, combs, and other things. They're adding more to the store constantly, so go check them out. They make some great stuff. And if you like shopping at Target, you can use our link in the description, go to Target, and buy whatever, and we will get a percentage. So if you want to support us, those are the best ways you can currently do it. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.